It was a cold autumn night when Jim Carrey left the studio after a long day of filming. His latest comedy project had kept him on set for nearly 14 hours straight, running through take after take until his facial muscles ached from the exaggerated expressions that had made him famous across America. Exhausted but satisfied with the day's work, he decided to stop at a gas station off the beaten path to fill up before heading home to his Beverly Hills residence. These small, mundane routines were his refuge, moments that connected him to ordinary reality, far from the cameras and the glare of spotlights. In Los Angeles, a city where celebrities were constantly watched, these stolen moments of normalcy were precious to Jim. The gas station, with its flickering fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the interstate, offered an anonymous comfort that the red carpets never could. As he waited for the tank to fill, Jim noticed something unusual in the farthest corner of the parking lot. An old sedan, a 90s model Ford with peeling paint and a dented rear bumper, sat partially hidden in shadows. The windows were slightly fogged, and what appeared to be clothes hung across the interior. Something about that car called to him in an inexplicable way, triggering both his curiosity and concern. Just then, a young man, appearing no more than 30, emerged from the station's bathroom, carrying what looked like a small bundle of clothes. His shoulders were hunched forward, his steps heavy, as though he carried not just the small bundle, but the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. The wind picked up, causing the man to pull his thin jacket tighter around himself and the bundle. As he approached the car, Jim realized with a start that the bundle moved. It was a baby. The young father looked nervously around before getting into the vehicle, as if afraid of being noticed. There was something in his eyes that caught Jim's attention. It wasn't just exhaustion, but a profound hopelessness mixed with fierce determination. It was a look Jim recognized from his own struggles before fame, when he too had faced uncertainty and hardship. Following an impulse he didn't fully understand, Jim walked toward the car and lightly tapped on the window. The man inside froze, looking up with unmistakable suspicion and fear. His hand instinctively moved closer to the baby on the passenger seat. "Hey, is everything okay?" Jim asked with a gentle smile, deliberately toning down the comic intensity that characterized him on screen. In this moment, he wasn't Jim Carrey the celebrity, but simply a concerned human being. The man lowered the window just enough to be heard, the cold night air rushing into the car. "Yes, we're fine," he responded quickly, his voice tense and brittle. The baby beside him began to whimper, a soft, hungry cry that cut through the night air. "Sounds like the little one's hungry," Jim commented, trying to ease the tension. He noticed the interior of the car now. Blankets arranged to form a makeshift bed in the back seat. A small collection of baby supplies haphazardly organized in the footwell, and the unmistakable signs of someone living out of their vehicle. "Can I help you out somehow?" "We don't need help," the man responded harshly, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed him. Pride and desperation warred in his expression, and Jim recognized that delicate balance all too well. Jim nodded, respecting the man's space and dignity. "That's all right. I'll be around if you change your mind." He gestured toward his own car, a luxury vehicle that suddenly seemed obscenely opulent in contrast. "I'm just filling up before heading home." He returned to his car, paid for his gas, but found himself unable to leave. Something about that scene, the father, the baby, their evident struggle to survive, touched something deep within Jim, echoing his own past struggles and losses. He had known what it was like to have nothing, to feel invisible, to wonder where the next meal would come from. Before his breakthrough, he had lived paycheck to paycheck, sometimes sleeping in his car when rent money ran short. Through the rearview mirror, he watched as the man retrieved an improvised bottle from the glove compartment and attempted to feed the baby, who continued crying. The bottle appeared half empty, and the baby's cries grew more insistent. The father's frustration and helplessness were visible even from a distance as he tried to comfort his child. The scene burned itself into Jim's mind. 25 years in Hollywood had brought him wealth beyond imagination, critical acclaim, and millions of fans worldwide. But sitting there in his luxury car, he felt a profound sense of disconnect. What was the purpose of all his success if he couldn't reach out to help another human being in need? Jim made a decision. He started his car and drove to the convenience store attached to the gas station. Inside, he quickly gathered supplies: formula, baby food, diapers, wet wipes, and a few ready-to-eat meals. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, raised an eyebrow at his selections. "Got a baby I don't know about, Mr. Carrey?" she asked, recognition lighting up her face despite the late hour. Jim smiled. "Just helping out a friend," he replied simply. When he returned to the parking lot, the old sedan was still there, its windows now completely fogged from the inside. The baby's cries had subsided, but Jim could see the father's silhouette, head resting against the steering wheel in what looked like defeat. He approached again, this time with the bags of supplies. Tapping gently on the window once more, he waited as the young man startled, and then reluctantly rolled down the window further than before. "I brought some things for the little one," Jim said, holding up the bags. "And some food for you too. It's getting cold tonight." The man stared at the bags, then at Jim, confusion and suspicion battling with desperate need in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice hoarse and raw. "You don't even know us." Jim considered his answer carefully. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it," he said finally. It wasn't quite the same situation, but Jim had never forgotten the people who had extended kindness to him during his struggles before fame, when he was just a young comedian from Canada, trying to make it in the unforgiving landscape of American entertainment. After a moment's hesitation, the man unlocked the passenger door. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words clearly difficult for him. "I'm Daniel." "This is Emma," he added, nodding toward the baby who had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep. "Jim," he replied simply, not bothering to add his last name. He suspected Daniel had already recognized him but appreciated that he wasn't making a big deal about it. He placed the bags on the passenger seat and watched as Daniel immediately checked the formula. "She's only 6 months old," Daniel explained, his voice softening as he looked at his daughter. "Usually takes her formula just fine, but we've been rationing it the last couple days." Jim nodded, understanding the unspoken reality. "There's enough there to last at least a week," he said. "The diapers should hold you for a while too." Daniel's eyes watered slightly, but he blinked rapidly, determined not to break down. "We'll be fine soon. I have a job interview tomorrow at a warehouse in Burbank. If I get it, we can stay at a motel until the first paycheck comes through." Jim wanted to ask how they had ended up here, what circumstances had led a clearly caring father and his infant daughter to living in a car in Los Angeles, but he held back. Those questions could wait. Right now, Daniel's pride was as fragile as it was important. "That's great," Jim said instead, keeping his tone casual. "In the meantime, it's going to drop below 50 degrees tonight. There's a decent motel just down the road that I know the owner of. Let me make a call and get you guys a room for the night." Daniel started to shake his head, but Emma stirred and whimpered in her sleep, and the refusal died on his lips. "Just for tonight," he conceded, "and I'll pay you back when I get on my feet." Jim nodded, though they both knew such a promise was easier made than kept. Still, it preserved Daniel's dignity, and that was what mattered most right now. As Jim walked back to his car to make the call, he felt an unexpected lightness in his chest. The disconnection he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that no movie role had given him in years. The image of Daniel and baby Emma trying to survive in that old sedan would stay with him. He knew he couldn't simply drive away now. Something inside told him that this chance encounter was significant, that these lives had intersected with his for a reason. As he dialed the number of the motel owner, an old friend from his early days in California, Jim made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't be just a one-night intervention. Daniel and Emma deserved more than temporary charity. They deserved a genuine chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Jim was determined to see this through. For tonight at least, a father and his daughter would sleep in warmth and safety. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The following morning, contrary to what would have been his day off, Jim Carrey returned to the same gas station. Despite arranging the motel room the previous night, something told him to check if Daniel had actually gone there. His intuition proved correct. The car was still there, parked in an even more discreet corner of the lot, partially hidden behind a dumpster. As Jim approached, he saw Daniel sleeping in the driver's seat, his body curled in an uncomfortable position, while baby Emma slept in a makeshift basket on the back seat. Nothing more than a laundry basket lined with a thin blanket. Jim's heart sank. The proud father had clearly chosen to save the motel voucher for another day, perhaps for worse weather or a more desperate situation. The November California morning brought a crisp chill, the kind that tourists never expected when they imagined the Golden State. Jim watched his breath form small clouds as he headed into the convenience store. He purchased coffee, a breakfast sandwich, some fruits, and more baby supplies. The same cashier from the night before gave him a knowing smile, but asked no questions. Carefully, Jim approached the car and tapped lightly on the window. Daniel woke with a start, his eyes wide with alarm as he instinctively reached for Emma in the back seat. The protective gesture spoke volumes about his priorities. "Sorry to wake you," Jim said softly, his famous face unusually serious in the morning light. "I brought something for you both to eat." Daniel looked at the items and then at Jim, distrust and gratitude battling for dominance in his exhausted eyes. After a moment's hesitation, he lowered the window fully, letting in the fresh morning air. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice hoarse from sleep and perhaps unshed tears. Jim shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling beneath his simple gray hoodie, a far cry from the tailored suits he wore to premieres. "Because someone did the same for me when I needed it." It wasn't exactly the same situation, but Jim had never forgotten the people who helped him during his darkest times. Before fame, when he too had occasionally lived in his car and struggled for opportunities in a city that chewed up dreamers daily. Reluctantly, Daniel accepted the coffee and sandwich. "Thank you," he murmured, the warmth from the cup seeming to thaw something in his rigid posture. "My name is Daniel Martinez." "Jim," he responded simply without mentioning his last name, though he suspected Daniel had recognized him already. "And who's this little champion?" he asked, looking at the baby who was beginning to stir in her makeshift bed. "This is Emma," Daniel replied, a slight smile appearing for the first time, transforming his tired face. "She's 6 months old." As Emma fully awakened, her big brown eyes took in the world with the innocent wonder that only babies possess. She didn't fuss or cry, simply observed, as though she had already learned that crying didn't always bring solutions. "She's beautiful," Jim said sincerely. "Looks like she's got your eyes." Daniel nodded, the pride of fatherhood momentarily overshadowing his circumstances. "Her mother's smile, though," he added quietly, a shadow crossing his face. The conversation continued cautiously, with Jim respecting the boundaries Daniel established. They talked about the weather, about the job interview Daniel had mentioned, about Emma's sleeping patterns, safe topics that didn't probe too deeply into how a father and daughter had ended up living in a sedan. Before leaving, Jim wrote his personal cell number on a piece of paper. "If you need anything, even if it's just to talk. Sometimes carrying everything alone is the hardest part." Daniel accepted the paper with a nod, but Jim could see the reluctance in his eyes, the struggle between necessity and pride that kept so many people from accepting help until it was too late. Over the next few days, Jim established a routine of stopping by the gas station, always bringing something different, sometimes food, other times clothes for Emma or hygiene items. He learned that Daniel had been staying in different parking lots around Los Angeles, moving every night to avoid attracting attention from security guards or police. Daniel shared bits and pieces of his story in these brief encounters. He had worked as a music teacher at a public school in San Diego. Emma's mother had left shortly after she was born, unable to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. The school had eventually let Daniel go when his performance suffered due to the challenges of being a single parent without support. "I came to LA thinking I could find better opportunities," Daniel explained during their third meeting. "But everything costs twice as much here, and without references or an address." Jim nodded, understanding the vicious cycle. No address meant no job meant no money for housing, and around it went. During these visits, Jim noticed subtle changes in Daniel. Though still reserved, he began to look forward to their conversations. The wariness in his eyes gradually diminished, replaced by cautious trust. Emma, too, seemed to recognize Jim, cooing and reaching for him when he came near. It was on the 5th day, when Jim arrived with a small teddy bear for Emma, that Daniel finally broke down. The simple gift, a soft brown bear with a red ribbon, seemed to symbolize everything he couldn't provide for his daughter. "I shouldn't accept this," he said, his voice breaking as he held the teddy bear. I can't even provide the basics for my daughter. What kind of father am I? A father who hasn't given up, Jim responded promptly, his own voice thick with emotion. And that's more than many ever do. Those simple words seemed to break something inside Daniel. The tears he had been holding back for so long finally surfaced, and Jim waited patiently and respectfully while he released months of repressed pain. Emma, sensing her father's distress, reached up from her basket and touched his face with tiny fingers, a gesture so tender it brought fresh tears to Daniel's eyes. When Daniel finally composed himself, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his worn jacket, Jim asked gently, "Do you want to tell me what happened? The whole story?" Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. Here, in the parking lot of a nondescript gas station in Los Angeles, he began to share his complete story with the first person who had truly seen him in months. "I was born and raised in San Diego," Daniel began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "Music was always my thing. I played in bands through high school and college, then got my teaching credential. I thought I had it all figured out. Steady job teaching music to middle schoolers, apartment near the beach, even if it was tiny." Jim listened intently, leaning against the car, giving Daniel the space to unfold his narrative at his own pace. "Then I met Sophia at a faculty party. She taught English, had this laugh that could light up a room." His face softened at the memory. "We moved in together after dating for a year. When she got pregnant with Emma, we were surprised but happy. Made plans, you know. Started saving for a house, a real one with a yard where Emma could play." Daniel paused, glancing back at his daughter, who had fallen asleep clutching the new teddy bear. Everything changed after Emma was born. Sophia, she changed. The doctors called it postpartum depression, but it was more than that. She couldn't connect with Emma, couldn't sleep. Started talking about how we'd made a mistake. 3 months in, I came home from work and found a note. She said she couldn't do it anymore, that she wasn't meant to be a mother. Jim remained silent, allowing Daniel to continue at his own pace. "I tried to make it work, just Emma and me. Applied for family leave, got some help from neighbors. But when I went back to teaching, it all fell apart. Couldn't focus on work, couldn't find reliable childcare I could afford. The school gave me warnings, then put me on probation. When they finally let me go, I couldn't make rent anymore." Daniel's voice grew quieter. "My parents are both gone. No siblings. Sophia's family blamed me for her leaving. So I packed what I could fit in the car and came to LA. Thought I could find session work as a musician or another teaching job. But it's been 3 months of closed doors and dead ends." The weight of Daniel's story hung in the air between them. Jim thought about the random circumstances that had brought them together. His impulse to stop at this particular gas station, his decision to approach the car, Daniel's gradual willingness to accept help. "Daniel," Jim said finally, "you've been carrying this alone for too long. Let me help you. Not just with coffee and supplies, but really help. I have connections in this town, people who owe me favors. There's a guest house on my property that's sitting empty. You and Emma could stay there while you get back on your feet." Daniel immediately began shaking his head, the instinctive rejection of charity rising up again. But Jim continued before he could speak. "It's not a handout. Think of it as one musician helping another. I started in stand-up comedy, but music's always been close to my heart too. And right now, that guest house is just gathering dust." The struggle was visible on Daniel's face, the desperate need warring with the last remnants of his pride. Emma stirred in her sleep, clutching the teddy bear tighter, and that simple action seemed to decide something for Daniel. "Just until I find work," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll help around your property. Do maintenance, whatever you need." Jim smiled, not the exaggerated grin familiar to millions of moviegoers, but a genuine expression of relief. "Deal. And fair warning, I'm terrible at remembering to water plants. So saving my garden alone would be earning your keep." For the first time since they'd met, Daniel laughed, a short, rusty sound, as if his laugh muscles had atrophied from disuse. "Emma and I are pretty good with plants. Her mother had a black thumb, but Emma seems to bring things to life just by being near them." As they made plans for Daniel and Emma to follow Jim to his home, something shifted in the air between them. The barriers that Daniel had built, necessary walls for survival on the streets, began to crumble, brick by brick. That evening, As Jim watched Daniel settle into the guest house, carefully placing Emma in a real crib for the first time in months, he realized that sometimes the most important roles we play in life never appear on any screen. "I never imagined my life would come to this point," Daniel began, looking at Emma, who slept peacefully in the back seat, clutching the teddy bear Jim had given her. "A year ago, I had everything. A good job as a music teacher, a small but comfortable home, and a wife I loved. Sophia was an English teacher, passionate about literature and inspiring young minds. We were so happy when we found out Emma was on the way." Jim listened attentively, without interrupting. He could feel the weight of the story he was about to hear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gas station parking lot, creating an oddly intimate space for such a personal revelation. Everything was going according to plan until the 7th month of pregnancy. Sophia started changing. Daniel's voice faltered. "At first, we thought it was just normal anxiety about becoming parents. She had trouble sleeping, became withdrawn, started questioning whether we were ready for a child." Daniel paused, running his fingers through his unkempt hair. "When Emma was born, it got worse instead of better. The doctors called it severe postpartum depression. But looking back, I think the signs were there even before the birth. Everything happened so quickly." Daniel's voice cracked. "One day I was planning our future as a family. The next I became a father and essentially single at the same time." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. Jim remained silent, his expressive face uncommonly still as he absorbed the painful narrative. "At first, I managed to hold things together. I took family leave from work. My neighbor helped with Emma. I kept thinking Sophia would come back, that she just needed time to work through her depression. I left messages, sent emails. Nothing." Daniel's eyes fixed on a distant point, as if looking into the past. "After a month, I got a text, just a text, saying she was in Arizona with her sister and she wasn't coming back, that she couldn't be a mother and needed to find herself." Jim nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting compassion without pity, a distinction Daniel clearly appreciated. "When I returned to work, everything started falling apart. I couldn't balance teaching hours with caring for a newborn. The daycare costs were astronomical, even with insurance benefits. Sleepless nights meant I couldn't focus during classes. My students' parents started complaining." Daniel looked down at his hands, calloused from guitar playing and now rough from the harsh realities of homelessness. "I started missing work. The quality of my teaching declined. I was called into the principal's office several times until eventually they let me go. Without income, I couldn't keep the apartment. Sophia's family blamed me for her leaving, said I must have pushed her too hard into motherhood." Jim shifted his weight against the car, giving Daniel space to continue his story, while watching a family happily piling into their SUV across the parking lot, the everyday normalcy that Daniel and Emma had lost. "My parents wanted me to move back with them to Nebraska, but that would mean leaving behind everything that connects Emma to her mother. Our life was in California. This car and Emma are all I have left of the life we built." "How long have you been living like this?" Jim asked carefully. "Almost 2 months now," Daniel replied, glancing around the parking lot as if suddenly remembering where they were. "At first I stayed in cheap motels, but the money ran out fast. I've been doing odd jobs, playing guitar at coffee shops when I can find someone to watch Emma for an hour, day labor when possible, just enough to feed her and put gas in the car." Daniel reached back to adjust Emma's blanket, a tender gesture that spoke volumes about his priorities. "I've been trying to get steady work, but without a permanent address and nowhere to leave Emma during interviews, it's nearly impossible. Most employers take one look at a guy who shows up with a baby and decide they don't need the hassle." Jim remained silent for a moment, processing everything he had heard. Daniel's story was devastating, but also revealed his inner strength. Many would have given up, placed the child for adoption, or yielded to the pressure to return to their parents' home, abandoning the memories of the life they'd built. But Daniel was fighting, even if it meant living in such precarious conditions. "Have you looked into social services?" Jim asked. Daniel nodded. "I tried, but there's so much red tape. Without an address, it's difficult to qualify for many programs. And to be honest," his voice dropped to almost a whisper, "I'm afraid they'll discover our situation and take Emma away into the foster care system." It was a legitimate fear, Jim thought. The system that was supposed to protect families sometimes separated those that just needed temporary support. He'd seen enough during his charity work to know how easily people could fall through the cracks of social safety nets. "The shelters are usually full," Daniel continued. "The few times I found space, it didn't feel safe for Emma, and the family shelters have waiting lists months long." Jim watched as Daniel gently straightened Emma's tiny sock that had started to slip off her foot. It was a small act of care that highlighted the fundamental decency of the man, a father determined to provide dignity for his daughter even when his own had been stripped away by circumstance. "What about your music?" Jim asked, noticing the guitar case tucked beneath blankets in the back seat. "You mentioned you were a music teacher." For the first time, a genuine spark lit Daniel's tired eyes. "Classical guitar is my specialty, but I play everything. Jazz, rock, blues. I was teaching middle school music, but I used to perform too before Emma. Had a regular weekend gig at a restaurant in San Diego." He smiled faintly. "That's where I met Sophia, actually. She came to hear me play every Friday for a month before I got up the courage to talk to her." Jim nodded, filing away this information. "Would you play something for me sometime?" Daniel looked surprised by the request. "Sure, I guess, though I'm out of practice. Haven't had much opportunity lately, and when Emma's sleeping, I don't want to wake her." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional sound of cars passing on the nearby highway. In that moment, as he watched Daniel tenderly adjusting the small blanket around Emma, Jim made a decision that would forever change 3 lives. "Daniel," Jim said finally, "I have a proposal for you." Daniel looked up, wariness returning to his expression. "It's not charity," Jim clarified quickly, recognizing the pride that had kept Daniel going through his ordeal. "It's an opportunity." "You mentioned you're a music teacher, right?" Daniel nodded, clearly intrigued by the serious tone in Jim's voice. "I'm executive producing an independent film," Jim continued. "It's not a big-budget production like I usually do. It's something more personal. We need someone to compose and perform some original pieces for the soundtrack. It would be contract work, fair pay, and most importantly, flexible. You could work remotely, on your own schedule, with Emma right there with you." Daniel's eyes widened with disbelief. "But you don't even know my work. How can you offer me something like this?" Jim smiled. "Call it intuition. And also because everyone deserves a second chance when life hits them hard. Do you still have samples of your music?" Yes. I have some compositions on my laptop, but the battery died weeks ago." He gestured toward an old computer case wedged between boxes in the back seat. "Perfect," Jim replied. "First step. Let's get you guys settled somewhere stable while we sort out the details of the work." Daniel's expression shifted between hope and suspicion. "I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Jim interrupted gently. "Not for yourself, if that makes it harder. For Emma. She deserves a safe place to sleep and develop. And the film genuinely needs a composer. My producing partner has been bugging me about it for weeks." Jim could see the internal struggle playing out on Daniel's face, the desperate need to provide for his daughter battling against the remnants of pride that had kept him independent thus far. "It would just be temporary," Daniel said finally, "until I get back on my feet. And I'd work hard, make sure the music is exactly what your film needs." "I know you will," Jim replied simply. As they made plans to follow Jim to a hotel where Daniel and Emma could stay while more permanent arrangements were made, the first genuine smile Jim had seen spread across Daniel's face. It transformed him, revealing the person he had been before tragedy and hardship had etched lines of worry around his eyes. "Jim," Daniel said as he carefully moved Emma to her car seat, still deep in sleep, "why are you really doing this? There must be thousands of musicians in LA looking for this kind of opportunity." Jim looked at the horizon, where the setting California sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Because 20 years ago, when I was still fighting for my break, someone saw potential in me when I was at my lowest point. They didn't just offer me a job, they offered me dignity. I've never forgotten that." He turned back to Daniel with a gentle smile. "Sometimes we're in a position to pass on what was given to us. Today that's me. Tomorrow, that might be you for someone else." As they prepared to leave the gas station parking lot, a place that had unexpectedly become the setting for this life-changing encounter, Jim felt a certainty he hadn't experienced in years. His impulse to stop that first night, to approach the car where a father and daughter were struggling to survive, had been more than random kindness. Some connections in life, Jim reflected as he watched Daniel carefully driving the old sedan behind his car, following him toward a new beginning, seemed destined to happen. "I have a proposal for you," Jim said after a few minutes of contemplative silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gas station parking lot, giving their conversation an oddly cinematic quality. "It's not charity, it's an opportunity." "You mentioned you're a music teacher, right?" Daniel nodded, intrigued by the serious tone in Jim's voice. He shifted slightly in his seat, his posture straightening with what looked like the first glimmer of hope he'd felt in months. "I'm executive producing an independent film," Jim continued, leaning against the sedan's door. "It's not a big production like I usually do. It's something more personal. We need someone to compose some original musical pieces for the soundtrack. It would be contract work, fair pay, and most importantly, flexible. You could work remotely, on your own schedule, with Emma right there with you." Daniel's eyes widened with the unexpected proposal. "But you don't even know my work. How can you offer me something like this?" Jim smiled, the expression warming his famous features. "Intuition. And also because everyone deserves a second chance when life hits them hard. Do you have musical talent beyond teaching?" Yes. Before I was a teacher, I composed music professionally. I still have some compositions on my laptop, but the battery's been dead for weeks." He gestured toward an old computer case wedged between boxes in the back seat, buried under baby supplies and what remained of his former life. "Perfect," Jim replied decisively. "First step, let's get you both settled somewhere stable while we work out the details." Despite his initial hesitation, Daniel eventually accepted Jim's help, not for his own sake, but for Emma's. That night they checked into a comfortable hotel in Santa Monica, where Daniel was able to give Emma a proper bath in a real tub, feed her in a high chair provided by the hotel staff, and finally sleep in an actual bed, instead of the reclined driver's seat that had served as his makeshift bedroom for weeks. Jim watched with quiet satisfaction as Daniel carefully tucked Emma into the hotel crib, the exhausted father's hands trembling slightly with emotion as he smoothed the clean sheets around his daughter. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," Jim promised as he prepared to leave. "Get some rest, both of you." The following day, Jim returned with his music producer, Ryan Taylor, a laid-back industry veteran with salt and pepper dreadlocks and decades of experience in film scoring. After plugging in Daniel's laptop and giving it time to charge, they listened to the compositions stored in his digital portfolio. Ryan's professional poker face dissolved within minutes. "This is exactly the type of sound we've been looking for in the more emotional scenes," he commented, looking at Jim with unmistakable approval. "The composition is complex but accessible, emotional without being manipulative." "Where did you find this guy?" Jim smiled mysteriously. "Sometimes talent finds you in the most unexpected places." With Ryan convinced of Daniel's abilities, Jim moved quickly. He found a small apartment near his production studio in Culver City and helped Daniel sign a 6-month lease, paying the full amount up front. "Consider this an advance on your soundtrack work," he insisted when Daniel tried to refuse, his pride still battling with his desperate circumstances. But Jim knew that housing was only part of the solution. Daniel needed support to care for Emma while he worked and rebuilt his career. Through personal connections, the invisible network that powered much of Hollywood's actual functioning, Jim secured a spot for Emma at a high-quality daycare center located in the same building as the production studio. "I think I underestimated your influence," Daniel commented with a shy smile when Jim showed him the daycare facility, with its bright colors, qualified staff, and thoughtfully designed play areas. "It's not influence, it's just persistence," Jim replied with a playful wink. "I've discovered that people generally want to help. They just need someone to point them in the right direction. And in this town, everyone's looking for a chance to bank some good karma." In the weeks that followed, the transformation was remarkable. With a secure roof over his head, meaningful work that valued his talent, and the assurance that Emma was being well cared for, Daniel began to emerge from the depression that had enveloped him since Sophia's departure. The haunted look in his eyes gradually faded, replaced by focused determination and occasional genuine smiles. His work on the film's soundtrack exceeded all expectations. The music he composed carried the emotional depth of someone who knew both extreme joy and pain, exactly what Jim's independent film, a tragic comedy about loss and new beginnings, needed. It's almost like you've lived through this story yourself, Jim remarked one evening as they listened to Daniel's latest composition, a delicate piano piece that somehow managed to convey both profound sadness and tentative hope. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. In some ways I have. Different circumstances, same emotions. Jim's film, titled Starting Over, was a departure from his usual comedic roles. He played a middle-aged man forced to rebuild his life after losing everything in a natural disaster. The project was deeply personal for Jim, inspired by his own journey through Hollywood's ups and downs, and his philosophical views on resilience and reinvention. As Daniel worked on the score, he and Jim developed a friendship that transcended their initial benefactor-recipient dynamic. They discovered shared interests beyond film and music. Both were avid baseball fans, though they supported rival teams, leading to good-natured arguments over the Dodgers versus the Padres. Both enjoyed hiking in California's diverse landscapes, and both had an unexpected passion for obscure documentaries. But not everything was smooth sailing. The fourth week brought a crisis when Daniel received a legal notification from Sophia's parents, Roger and Diane Winters, who had finally located him and were threatening to sue for custody of Emma, claiming he was an unfit father. They never accepted that Sophia married me, Daniel explained bitterly, pacing the small apartment living room while Emma napped in her newly furnished bedroom. I wasn't good enough for their daughter, a public school teacher with musician dreams instead of the lawyer or doctor they wanted for her. Now they're using my period of homelessness against me, claiming I endangered Emma. Jim, who rarely showed his serious side in public, appeared surprisingly determined. We're not going to let them take Emma. You're an amazing father, and we're going to prove it. He immediately connected Daniel with Patricia Holden, one of Los Angeles's top family law attorneys, who specialized in cases involving parental rights. The meeting took place in Jim's home office, with Emma contentedly playing with toys on a blanket nearby. The good news, Patricia explained after reviewing the legal documents, is that they don't have a strong case. The bad news is that they have resources and seem determined to use them. They're painting your period of homelessness as willful endangerment, rather than what it was. A father doing everything possible to keep his family together during a crisis. What are our options? Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. We fight, Patricia replied simply. We document everything you're doing right, stable housing, employment, Emma's excellent care and development. We gather character witnesses, including Mr. Carrey here, who can testify to your dedication as a father, and we prepare for a potential court battle, though I'm hoping we can resolve this through mediation. Jim, sitting quietly in the corner, nodded firmly. Whatever resources you need, they're available. Daniel and Emma deserve to stay together. In the days that followed, Daniel threw himself even more intensely into his work, as if proving his value as a composer might somehow translate to proving his worth as a father. The pressure and stress manifested in the music he created, darker, more intense pieces that actually fit perfectly with the film's emotional climax. This is brilliant, Ryan commented during a studio session. But are you okay, man? There's so much pain in these notes. Daniel managed a tired smile. Just channeling everything into the music. It helps, actually. Jim, watching from the control room, recognized the coping mechanism. He'd done the same countless times throughout his career, translating personal struggles into creative output. It was therapeutic, but could also become an unhealthy escape, if not balanced with actual processing of emotions. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of legal preparation and recording sessions, Jim invited Daniel and Emma to his home for dinner. As they sat on his spacious patio overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Emma happily exploring a new set of toys Jim had coincidentally had on hand, Jim addressed the elephant in the room. You know, when I was struggling early in my career, I thought I had to handle everything alone. Being strong meant never asking for help, Jim said, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It took me years to realize that true strength is knowing when to accept support. Daniel looked up from helping Emma stack colorful blocks. I'm trying, he said quietly. It's just hard to trust that good things can last when everything's been taken away before, Jim finished for him. I get it, but look at how far you've come in just a month. You're creating amazing music. Emma's thriving, and we're going to fight these custody threats with everything we've got. Daniel nodded slowly, watching his daughter as she concentrated intently on balancing one more block on her tower. For her, I can do anything, even learn to accept help. Jim smiled, recognizing the breakthrough for what it was. That's all anyone can ask. As the custody battle loomed on the horizon, Daniel continued his dual focus, creating music that would help tell Jim's story on screen while fighting to keep his own story intact, with Emma at its center. The little girl, oblivious to the legal machinations surrounding her future, continued to flourish in her new stable environment, her laughter a powerful reminder of what was truly at stake. For Jim, watching this transformation reinforced his belief in the power of unexpected connections. What had begun as a chance encounter at a gas station had evolved into something that was changing multiple lives, not just Daniel and Emma's, but his own as well. In helping them find a new beginning, he'd rediscovered a sense of purpose beyond the cameras and acclaim that had defined his public life for decades. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months, Daniel faced the future with something that had been missing during his darkest days living in that old sedan: hope. The legal battle was intense and unforgiving. Sophia's parents, Richard and Diane Winters, were influential people in their San Diego community. He, a prominent orthopedic surgeon, she, a member of the city council. They had hired an aggressive attorney who specialized in family law, a sharp-dressed woman named Victoria Chambers, who was known for her ruthless courtroom tactics and high success rate. The Winters claimed that Daniel had essentially kidnapped their granddaughter by leaving San Diego without notifying them, and that his inability to maintain stable employment and housing proved his unfitness as a parent. Their petition for custody painted a damning picture of Daniel as an irresponsible dreamer who had put his daughter at risk through poor decision-making. Jim didn't simply hire one of Los Angeles' best attorneys to defend Daniel. He remained steadfastly by his side throughout the entire process. It would have been easy for him to provide financial resources and step back. Celebrity good deed accomplished, conscience cleared. But something about this situation touched deeply on his own unresolved issues about family and genuine connection. "Why are you doing all this for us?" Daniel asked one night, after a particularly grueling meeting with their legal team. They were sitting in Daniel's apartment, legal documents spread across the coffee table between them. "You've already given us a fresh start, an apartment, a job. You could simply walk away now." Jim looked at Emma, who played happily on the carpet with new toys, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around her future. Her infectious giggles as she stacked colorful blocks filled the room with a joy that defied the gravity of their situation. "When I was young, before any success came my way, I lived in my car for a while," Jim revealed, surprising Daniel. "I didn't have a child to care for, so my situation doesn't even compare to what you've faced. But I know what it feels like when it seems the world has turned its back on you. The difference is, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for Emma. That requires a kind of courage few people possess." Jim paused, gazing out the apartment window at the Los Angeles skyline. "Besides, I'll tell you a secret. Famous people like me are often incredibly lonely. We have teams, fans, colleagues, but rarely genuine connections. Finding someone as authentic as you, Daniel, is rare in my world." The case reached the courtroom more quickly than expected due to the Winters' connections. Confident in their social status and financial resources, they anticipated an easy victory. They were visibly shocked when Jim Carrey walked into the courtroom alongside Daniel, immediately drawing media attention to the case that had previously been just another family court dispute. Daniel's attorney presented substantial evidence of his progress: his stable apartment, employment contract, daycare records showing Emma's healthy development, and even a letter from the pediatrician attesting to the excellent care Daniel provided his daughter. Photos and videos documented Emma's happy life in her new home, her developmental milestones being met or exceeded. But the unexpected turning point came when Jim took the witness stand. "Mr. Carrey," began the Winters attorney, clearly attempting to discredit his involvement. "What exactly is your relationship with Mr. Martinez? Isn't it true that you've only known each other for a few months?" "Yes, that's true," Jim responded with a seriousness few associated with his public persona. His normally animated face was composed, his voice measured and clear. "But in that short time, I've witnessed paternal devotion that many men never achieve in a lifetime." Daniel lost everything, his wife, his job, his home, but never, not for a single moment, did he abandon his daughter or fail to prioritize Emma's well-being. Jim continued, his voice gaining intensity as he leaned slightly forward in the witness box. I've watched Daniel rise from the ashes of his personal tragedy. He has transformed every opportunity he's received into a step forward for his daughter. That's not just admirable, it's heroic. When questioned about his own motivations, Jim answered with disarming honesty. I met Daniel when he was at his most vulnerable, living in a car to keep his family together. What I saw was a father willing to sacrifice everything out of love. In a world where so many walk away from their responsibilities, how could I not recognize and support someone like that? The courtroom fell silent as Jim concluded. The Winters want Emma because they believe they can offer her more material things. Daniel wants Emma because she is his entire world. The difference is fundamental. The judge, a seasoned family court veteran named Honorable Claudia Richardson, listened intently throughout the proceedings. After several days of testimony, she rendered her decision to maintain full custody with Daniel, granting the Winters only supervised visitation rights. Her ruling directly cited Jim's testimony about Daniel's extraordinary commitment as a father, even in the most adverse circumstances. While the court appreciates the Winters' concern for their granddaughter, Judge Richardson stated, the evidence clearly shows that Mr. Martinez has demonstrated exceptional dedication to his child's welfare despite overwhelming obstacles. The stability he has established in recent months, coupled with his unwavering commitment during their period of homelessness, speaks to his fitness as Emma's primary caregiver. Outside the courtroom, an unexpected scene unfolded. Diane Winters, Sophia's mother, approached Daniel with tears in her eyes. I was wrong, she said, her voice trembling. I just wanted a piece of Sophia back, and Emma is all we have left of her. But I saw today how much you loved our daughter, how much you love our granddaughter. Sophia chose well. That moment marked the beginning of a cautious reconciliation between Daniel and Sophia's parents, uniting them through their shared love for Emma and the memory of Sophia. Richard Winters, initially more resistant, eventually extended an olive branch as well, offering to help with Emma's future education fund, not as a replacement for Daniel's role, but as a grandfather wanting to contribute. In the weeks following the trial, Daniel's life continued to flourish. The soundtrack he composed for Jim's film received critical acclaim when early segments were previewed for industry insiders. The haunting melodies and emotional depth of his compositions opened doors to other projects. He began teaching private music lessons again, building a stable clientele that allowed him to work primarily from home to be with Emma. Jim remained present in their lives, not as a distant benefactor, but as a genuine friend and eventually as an uncle figure to Emma, who squealed with delight whenever Uncle Jim appeared with his trademark silly faces and voices. During the film's wrap party, with Emma sleeping peacefully in Diane Winters' arms while Daniel chatted with music industry executives across the room, Jim observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. You've changed his life forever, commented Ryan, the music producer, approaching with 2 champagne flutes. Jim shook his head, accepting the glass. Actually, it was the opposite. Daniel reminded me why I got into this industry in the first place, to tell stories that mean something, that touch people. His story is more powerful than any script I've ever read. What about you two? Will you continue working together? Ryan asked, sipping his champagne. Jim smiled, watching Daniel across the room as he now waved in Jim's direction. Without a doubt, I'm financing a recording studio for him. Daniel has music inside him that the world needs to hear, compositions that transform pain into beauty. And I found something money can't buy, a chosen family. That night, as Daniel tucked Emma into bed in her newly decorated room, with Jim watching from the doorway, he reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. From a cold, lonely car in a gas station parking lot to a life filled with purpose, renewed connections and opportunities, all because a stranger stopped to ask if he was okay. You know what Sophia always used to say? Daniel commented softly, adjusting the blanket around Emma. That angels rarely have visible wings. Sometimes they drive expensive cars and tell jokes. Jim chuckled quietly, his eyes shining with contained emotion. I'm no angel, believe me. Just someone who recognized in you the same struggle I once faced. Angel or not, you did what no one else did, Daniel replied. You stopped. You saw. You acted. In the end, maybe that's what we all need. Someone who simply notices we're struggling and reaches out a hand. As the two men stood in the gentle glow of Emma's night light, watching her peaceful sleep, the unspoken bond between them solidified, a connection forged through crisis and compassion, more authentic than any Hollywood relationship Jim had known. The premiere of Starting Over months later became a celebration not just of Jim's film, but of the real-life story that had unfolded alongside its production. Daniel's soundtrack received a standing ovation, the melodies speaking to universal experiences of loss and renewal. Critics noted that Jim's performance seemed deeper, more nuanced than his previous work, few knowing that his portrayal of a man rebuilding his life had been influenced by the real transformation he'd witnessed in Daniel. The film's success opened even more doors for Daniel's composing career. With Jim's backing, the recording studio became a reality, a modest but professional space where Daniel could create while remaining close to Emma. The studio's walls featured framed photos documenting their journey, Emma's first birthday celebration, Daniel receiving his film credit, and a candid shot of the three of them at the beach, building sandcastles as the California sun set behind them. And so, in a world often marked by indifference, the story of Jim Carrey, Daniel Martinez, and little Emma became a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism don't occur under spotlights, but in the quiet parking lots of life, when someone chooses to see the invisible and do the unexpected. For Jim, who had spent decades making millions laugh, his most meaningful role turned out to be one that never appeared on screen, that of a friend who helped a broken family become whole again, and in doing so, found a piece of himself that had been missing all along.